Okay, topic 2 is about domain and range. So when you think about the situation cards that we looked through, each one of them had inputs and outputs. So if you look at the list of coordinates here and the table here, we see that this situation from number 13 had to do with a Coke machine. So the inputs were the buttons that you would press, A1, A2, A3, etc. And the output, what you get out of the Coke machine, is the drinks that you wanted, right? So if I went to go graph these, it's obviously not just strictly numerical data, so I'm just going to make up the scale on the X and Y axis. So I'm writing A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3 on the X-axis because those are my inputs, my X's. Then my outputs are going to go on the Y-axis. Because these aren't actually numbers, I'm just going to kind of make them up where they go. It doesn't matter. So then I'm going to draw my points. So if I were to press A1, I would get a Dr. Pepper. If I were to press A2, I would get a Sprite, A3, Diet Dr. Pepper, B1, a water, B2, a Sunkist, and B3, a root beer. So there's my points. Remember that scatter plots aren't always a part of a function family. This is definitely not. There's no equation I can make that will tell me, oh, if you press this button and multiply it by 5 and add it to 3, you're going to get this drink. So this is just a scatter plot of random points. There's no pattern. That's, again, why the points didn't really matter. We're just using that as an example to understand what domain and range mean. So we'll get there in just a second. So one new thing from this topic is a mapping. A mapping consists of these two bubbles. In the left bubble, you're going to put all of your inputs, or the X values. The right bubble is where you put all of your outputs, or your Y values. Okay, so in this case, our inputs were the buttons. And the outputs were the drinks. Okay, now the way a mapping works is that you use arrows to connect one side to the other. So for example, we know that A1 would give you Dr. Pepper. So I'm going to draw an arrow from A1 to Dr. Pepper. If I pressed A2, I would get a Sprite. So I draw an arrow from A2 to Sprite. If I press A3, I get Diet Dr. Pepper, etc., etc. Okay, so that's all a mapping is. It's just a visual representation of inputs going to their respective outputs. Okay, so let's get into what domain and range really mean. This first is going to ask the question, what are the inputs for this situation? In other words, what would you plug in? What would you communicate to the machine? What would the input be? In this case, it would be the buttons, right? So I'm going to make a list. A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3. Now in math, when you're making a list, we use different types of notation. These little squiggly brackets denote any time that you have a mathematical list. Okay, in other words, it's sometimes called a set, but those little squiggly brackets denote when you have a mathematical list, which is what we have here. Okay, so then it asks us for the outputs. Well, those are the drinks themselves. So again, I'm going to make my list. Of all my drinks, draw my little squiggly brackets to show all of my outputs. The process we just went through of inputs and outputs is really what domain and range is. So when it asks what is domain, domain is the set of all possible input values. The set of all possible input values, okay? You could also say the list of all possible input values. And remember the input is the X's, okay? So the range, very similar, is the set of all possible output values, or the Y's. So let's just kind of put this into practice. It says, consider the representations below. What are the domains and ranges for each of the following? So, number 1, they're asking us for the domain. Again, they're asking us for a list of all the inputs. Well, those are my x's, right? My domain has to do with my x's. So I just start to make my list. -3, -2, 0, 4, 5, 7. Put my curly brackets there, and there's my domain. It is the list of all the input values. Okay, so same thing for the range. The range is for the y's. Now I will say, you always want to write domain and range from least to greatest. So when I go to make my range right now, I'm not going to start with 2. I'm actually going to start down here at -5 because that's the smallest number in the range. The next smallest would be -1. Next smallest would be 2. I'm going to pause here to note that there are 2 2s. However, we're not going to write them twice. It's kind of like my example earlier in the year when I said, what animals did you see at the zoo? You would say, I saw zebras. You wouldn't say, I saw a zebra, a zebra, a zebra. You just clump them all together. Same thing here. You're just telling the person who reads the range that 2 is a possibility. You don't have to tell them how many times that 2 is used or how many times that 2 appears in the coordinates. You just say, hey, 2 is one of the range values. Same with this 3. Okay, so number 2, very similar. Again, the domain is the inputs. So I'm going to list these out. And the range is the outputs. Again, from least to greatest. Oops. Okay. This last one's probably the trickiest, partly because there's so many coordinates, but also because there's not a nice and easy table or mapping or list of coordinates for us to go from. The coordinates are on the graphs themselves, right? So one option would be for me to zoom in super close here and just write the coordinates out, right? For example, this would be 82, maybe 90, okay? This over here would be maybe 87, 110. I don't know, making these up. I could do it this way and write these out and find my domain and range that way, okay? Or I could just use the graph itself rather than writing every single point out. So if I know the domain is the x values, right? Well, that means I need to focus on my x-axis down here, okay? So when I go point by point, I'm going to look to see which x values from the x-axis are being used. So for example, I'm looking across here and I see this point is using this x value of 82. That is the first value in my domain. So I'm going to keep reading across here. Oh, 84. That's the next one that's used. So that's my next domain value. I'm going to keep reading across here. Oh, I see that 86 is being used. Notice it's on there twice, but I only have to write it one time. Keep reading 87. Keep reading 88. Etc., etc. A lot of numbers there. Okay, so now I do the same thing for the range. Okay, the range, however, is going to be the y value. So I'm going to focus my eyes on that blue axis, the y coordinates. So again, I'm going to start with the smallest number, which would be down here at 75. I'm going to read to see when I actually have a point that hits this graph. I'm actually going to erase all this other purple. Okay. So 75 doesn't have a point on it, but all of a sudden right here I've got a point. So let's call that maybe like 80. Got a point right here. Maybe that's 120. 25, 225. I'm just going to keep trekking up here. Running out of room. There we go. A lot of numbers there. So to recap what I just did, when looking at a graph, what is the easiest way to list the domain and range from least to greatest? We're going to follow Diller the robot. He's going to be our inspiration anytime we have a graph. What that stands for is D is domain, and it is done from left to right. So what I did is I focused my eyes on the x-axis and moved from left to right. That was for domain, okay, Diller. Then for range, that's this R here, I went from bottom to top. Okay, again, focused my eyes on the y-axis and went up. That keeps things going from least to greatest and also helps you hone your eyes in on the correct values from the coordinates. X is for domain and Y is for range. Okay, so let's practice that below, and I'll answer, or I'll fill this part in here in a little bit. So for number 4, again, same process. Domain is from left to right, so I'm going to focus my eyes on the x-axis here. Okay, so -9, I got nothing on -9, so that is not a value in my domain. -8, I got nothing on it, so that is not a value in my domain. First thing I've got here is -6. It's got a point on it, so that's the first number in my domain. Keep reading across. -4 has a point on it. Keep reading across. 0 has a point on it, etc., all the way across. Okay, so then I do the same exact thing for the range, but range is from bottom to top. So I start down here, -9, I got nothing. -8, I got nothing. Keep going up. -5 is the first number that has points on it, so that's the first number in my domain. I mean my range, sorry. 0 and then 4. Remember, at any point, if I'm going too fast, you can always just pause this video. Okay, so number 5, same thing. Starting with the domain, I want to focus my eyes on the x-axis. The only x value that I see that has points on it is number 1 right here. So my list is going to be pretty short. It's going to have a 1, and that's literally it. There's no other value in my domain. So it's a list of 1 item. Range goes the opposite direction. My y-axis. Starting at the bottom, I got nothing. First thing I see is -3. Then I have 0, and then +3.